Hello, everyone. I have the privilege today of interviewing Jessica Fein. She's the author of Breathtaking, a memoir of family, dreams, and broken genes. In this book, Jessica takes readers on a powerful journey through the profound joys and heart-wrenching challenges of love and loss. This book is a memoir about her daughter, Dahlia, who was diagnosed with a rare degenerative disease. And, inspired by her daughter's spirit, and you'll find in the book just this irrepressible zest for life, Jessica and her family just embark on this remarkable journey of love, resilience, and self discovery. It's just a wonderful, wonderful book. Jessica is also the host of the podcast, I Don't Know How You Did It. I'm sorry, I Don't Know How You Do It. And her writing has appeared in numerous publications: Newsweek, Psychology Today, the Boston Globe, Huffington Post, etc. So I hope you will listen to this episode and be taken away by this incredible story, and maybe be inspired to read the book and share it with others. Hello, I'm Sue Andersen, grief guide and yoga teacher, dedicated to helping individuals navigate the challenging journey of loss. Welcome to Growth from Grief, where I aim to offer strategies to transition from the depths of grief to the path of healing. Whatever loss you are grappling with, here you'll discover support to ease both the physical and emotional burdens of grief. Together, let's embark on a journey towards strength, peace, and healing. I'm so glad you are here. Hi, Jessica. Welcome so much to Growth from Grief. I'm so glad to be talking with you today.
Thank you so much for having me.
You're welcome. So I read your book, Breathtaking, and I had to read it in like chunks because I was so taken up with the story, but not just that. I was really caught in the emotions that you and your family were going through, and I actually had to stop and like process that. It was so deep, I guess. I just
Yeah.
really, really felt all those emotions, especially that thread of love that really goes through the entire book. So you kind of carry the reader through this whole process from the time that you and your husband were struggling to conceive, through the adoptions, and then all of the time with Dahlia and dealing with her disease. So I thank you very much. It was just a wonderful, wonderful narrative about and memoir about
Well,
yours.
thank you. And thank you for noticing that, because that's exactly what I think the book is a love story. And I say that right up front, or maybe on the back cover or something, because, people hear bits and pieces and they think, oh my gosh, that's going to be a heavy read, which, it is heavy, but it's also, I think, relatable. And, I think there are definitely moments of levity, but the thread that carries through absolutely is a very gigantic love that I've been fortunate to have, not only for my kids, but, for other members of my family as well, whether that's siblings or my spouse or my parents.
Right, right, right. So can you tell us a little bit about Dahlia?
Absolutely, absolutely. So Dahlia well, let me just say, is probably the most, uh, the sweetest, feistiest, most beautiful human that I have had the pleasure of knowing. And um, I am so blessed that I got to be her mother for her lifetime of 17 years. Um, so, Dahlia, as you indicated at the beginning, my husband and I had a pretty rocky road to parenthood, but ultimately found ourselves in Guatemala. And we adopted three children, not at the same time. We adopted them every 2 years. And Dahlia was our middle child. And she, it was funny. We brought her home to Boston area at 6 months. And right from the start, there were several people who said, "Oh, she's an old soul." And I loved that. I don't really know what it means, but there's something I think in just the somebody's eyes that make people say, "Oh, she's an old soul." And Dahlia definitely had this really mesmerizing gaze, There was always a twinkle, but definitely also you could tell there was such a huge depth there. And when she was 5, she was diagnosed with an ultra rare mitochondrial disease called MRF syndrome, which stands for myoclonic epilepsy, ragged red fibers, which was totally crazy to us for so many reasons. It was just mind blowing. Even though I had suspected and really fought for a diagnosis, I had suspected something wasn't developing correctly, but never in a million years did I think that something was this like insidious disease that made no sense because when she was diagnosed at 5, it was like such a mystery on so many levels to us. An ultra rare disease means the doctors don't have much data to go on.
Right.
And even beyond that, the whole thing made no sense to us. I mean, quite literally, like I didn't even know what mitochondria were. I have since learned everything there is to know. So if you have any questions about what mitochondria are, I could answer them quite expertly. But um, also, she was just so happy and full of energy, and you know, it was really confounding to us. And when she was 9, the disease really blossomed. So, we knew about this disease lurking in the background, and there were manifestations to be sure, and they were getting more severe. But it was kind of like, you have a monster living in your house, and it's behind a closed door, and you know that at some point it's going to break through. But you don't even know really what the different like personalities of the monster are going to be. You just know it's there. So you're always on edge. And sometimes it'll like stick a paw out, or something like that and give you a hint. That's kind of working for me. I've never really thought about it that way before, but that is kind of what it felt like. Anyhow, so when she was 9, she became very, very, very sick, and we were in the hospital for 3 months. And at that point, she needed a tracheotomy. And so, for people who don't know, that's when you have a little hole put in your neck with a little tube, and you breathe that way, bypassing how most of us breathe, because Dahlia's lungs could no longer breathe on their own, and she needed the assistance of a ventilator. She became ventilator dependent. And at that time, she lost a lot of functionality. She lost her ability to walk and talk and eat, and again was ventilator dependent. I'll pause there because you asked me to tell you about her and I gave you a lot. So I'll pause because I know it's a lot to take in when people are hearing it for the first time.
Yes, and what really struck me about her in your narrative is that throughout all of this, she is happy. She is dancing because she could move her shoulders. For example, at one point you talk about that when she lost the use of her arms or her legs as the disease gradually took hold. And I was just so struck by that, that she could find for me, this is how I felt about it. Like you as the parent were like, like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do on edge? And she, as the child, is just like, how can I have fun? I mean, that was
That is
the way
so
I took
exactly
it.
right. And that is exactly how it was. And so then as the parent, despite my like, I've got to cure this disease and I've got to solve this and I've got to da, 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 I would just look at her and understand that there was another way of being. And I really learned so much from her because she was the one who was being affected so profoundly. And I felt like if I were in that situation, I would be petrified, furious,
Right.
all the things, and just be like, all I want to do is lay in bed and, and experience all of the yuck. And she was like, what are we doing today? Let's go, let's do it. And so then as her mother, it was on me to say, like, okay, I'm in.
Yeah.
And really to create an environment and a childhood despite this horrible monster, not
Right.
only for her, but for my other two kids.
Right. 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 And, throughout this time, you lost a lot of people in your life. Your
Yes.
sister, your mom, your dad. I mean, it was just like this, almost this this standard level of emotion that you were going through. And then, these ebbs and flows with all these other deaths. And I'm just wondering if you can talk about how did you process this grief? There was so much going on with raising three kids, or when your sister Nomi died. I think you were in the process of adopting. Is that
Well,
correct?
Nomi died actually earlier. Nomi died
Okay.
right before my husband and I got married. Then my other
Okay.
sister died when um, right before COVID. So
Okay.
we're really in the throes of taking care of Dahlia. My other sister died.
Right. Right.
Yeah,
So yeah, that was just so much to process,
yeah,
and working full time, raising the family, all these healthcare issues. How, how did you do it? I mean,
yeah.
how did you release that grief? How did you process it?
Yeah, hence the name of my podcast. I don't know how you do it because that's what people, I was, oh,
Yes.
every day. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you do it. But here's the thing. The first death I experienced, that of my sister when I was 27 and she was 30. That was the one that cracked me wide open. That was the one that really changed my worldview. It was out of the blue. Like I
Right.
had been on the phone with her a couple hours earlier, and it was just a sudden death kind of scenario. Um, and what I write in the book is I had been like in a bubble of sorts before that, and her death punctured the bubble.
Mhm.
And then I saw the world through the clarity of the puncture, not through the hazy sheen of the bubble, because I understood that, okay, anything can happen at any time,
Right.
all of the things that sometimes it takes a lifetime to really be able to internalize and incorporate. I lost my best friend out of nowhere, And so I had never before spent a day on this earth without my sister. It was just such a profound, profound loss. And it's interesting because, people say the worst thing that can happen to somebody is the loss of a child. I always kind of pause on that because, first of all, I don't really believe in saying worst. We don't know. Everything's different for every person. And
Right.
it is among the worst things that's ever happened to me. But losing my sisters, and especially that first loss, had a really, really, really profound impact on me that in many ways was of equal measure to the loss of a child. And every loss that came after that was layered on top and nestled within that first loss
Mhm.
because they were all so related. And every time I've lost somebody, it really does compound all of the losses that came before because, of course, you want to curl up on your mother's lap when something horrible happens. Then my mother had already died, so then it reminds me,
Right.
where's my mom right now? I need my mom, or whatever it
Yeah.
is. Like, or even, you go to the cemetery because it's the anniversary of one person's death and there they all are, right? It says all comes hitting you at once because there's so many.
Right. 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 And I, just from my own experience, having experienced a lot of losses during my 20s, as you described, 27, when your sister died, I didn't, I certainly was grieving during that time, but it wasn't until much later when my son died that a lot of that came back. And I realized, like, oh, I was angry at this person and I never dealt with that anger. And I feel it coming up again. So I know I have to deal with that anger. So
Yeah.
it just sort of, like you say, it kind of compounded. It wasn't that I wasn't dealing with it, but there were certain emotions that maybe just got swept to the side because there was something else going on,
Right.
you know?
Yes, I totally relate to that. I feel that the most with my older sister, Rachel, because when she died, as I mentioned, I was so in the throes of caring for Dahlia. And so it was hard to fully immerse myself in grieving for her. And I feel like that one is still bubbling beneath the surface.
Yeah, yeah, I understand that. I understand that. Um, I want to go back to the book. I really, really was struck by this passage, and you talk about it on your podcast as well, about the 4th of July, this one 4th of July where you wanted to have a normal 4th of July for your boys, and how it just, when you went back to work, you felt like you lived in two different worlds. And I wonder if you could tell our listeners
Yeah.
about that, because that really struck me.
Yes, absolutely. And, I think that there's so much about when we're grieving or when we're suffering that is so isolating because we feel like there's the, face and front that we put on in the world and we try to relate and connect to people as we always did, but yet we're so changed. So, when Dahlia became so sick at 9, everything we did really needed to revolve around her condition. And so we were so mindful. We didn't want her to feel so different from the rest of the family. So we all kind of accommodated her abilities rather than obviously she couldn't kind of step into what the other kids were doing. So, at some point it was okay, but for example, on this July 4th, shouldn't the others be able to go see fireworks, right? It's a
Right.
seemingly simple thing. But there was really no way we could take Dahlia out for a number of reasons into a big crowd to see fireworks. So it meant we would take the other kids and not take Dahlia with us, which was kind of a first time we had done something like that. And we, of course, whenever we weren't with Dahlia, we would need two people to hire to care for her, a nurse and a babysitter. So it was logistically complicated and expensive and everything else. But so it was. And so we went off to have this like wholesome family evening. And one thing after another went wrong. I mean, like we weren't in the right place. We couldn't even see the fireworks. Our eldest ran off and got lost, and we had to involve the police. I mean, it was this whole crazy thing. And it was not this wholesome experience we had imagined. It was just this like insanity. And when we finally found our child and missed the fireworks and got home, Dahlia had lost a tooth. And that seems like that should also be a pretty simple thing. But the problem was we couldn't find the tooth. And with the trach, there's like this little inflatable balloon that sits at the bottom of the trachea. And there was a concern that the tooth, she may have swallowed the tooth and it may have been resting on that. And when you deflate that, if the tooth had been resting there, when you deflate the balloon, the tooth could have gone into her lung.
Okay.
I mean, it could have been a real serious crisis. And so it was one of those things where that, when we came home, meant running to the emergency room. And indeed, they did see that the tooth was resting there and it had to be an emergency surgery. The whole night was a total wreck. And it really struck me as even more so because it was wanting to live a quote unquote normal evening. Right.
Right.
And so what I talk about is when I go back to work, and that was so crazy for me was this whole, as you mentioned, I worked during the whole thing and I faced a lot of judgment for that. And that's, we could talk about that, but I worked and I would go into work and be in that environment and trying to fit into this world that had always been so comfortable for me. And sometimes I just was like, whoa, I cannot relate. And so what happened was going back after the long weekend and everybody being like, hey, how you doing? How's your fourth? And, it's this decision that as grievers, we make a million times a day without even thinking about it, right? Like, how much am I going to share? Same thing as when you go to the grocery store and somebody's like, hey, how you doing? Or how many kids do you have? There's so many
Right.
choices we have to make all the time. How will I answer this question? And so what I talk about in that story is feeling so out of place in my what had been my comfort place, this thing of work, feeling like I'm so different from everybody else now. They don't understand all the things bubbling beneath the surface. And at home, things were so different. So it was kind of like these two worlds that it felt very like Twilight Zone-y, because
Mm.
both worlds were so upside down. And of course, at home, people understood what was happening most of the time. I mean, we didn't really understand the bigger picture, but we knew we were all in this topsy-turvy world together. And so that ended up being a place where we could really feel more at home, even in this crazy, crazy situation. And outside of home felt very strange.
Yeah, I bet. I can't imagine even beginning to try to explain it, people would be like, what? It
Yeah.
just, it,
And it's been
it,
interesting. A lot of my colleagues, former colleagues, have read the book and said, I mean, I knew you had a sick daughter, but I had no idea.
right.
I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting one time and a bunch of people in the meeting, and the question was whether we were going to break for lunch. And this one guy says, I'm okay. I have a feeding tube or something like this, he says. And I thought, oh, I got to talk to him. My daughter had a feeding tube. She got all of her nourishment through the feeding tube. And it was like, you know, a couple of drum beats in my head before I realized he was kidding. It's a
Right.
really weird joke to make, but people say things all the time without
Yes.
understanding.
Yes.
Like here, I was thinking, oh, we can connect over this,
Right.
right? And it
Right.
does make you think about so many invisible disabilities, and we should all say things. I'm sure I've said a million things that have landed with people the wrong way. I'm sure of it,
Right.
because we don't think about it.
Right. Exactly. Exactly. I had an experience similar where, so my son died by self-inflicted gunshot.
Hmm.
And how many times prior to this have any of us been in a meeting and people talk about stuff and they say, oh, just, I can't take it anymore. Just put a gun to my head or
Oh,
something like that.
God. Yes. And I felt that way after my sister,
Yeah.
she died of cardiac arrest. And yes, when people be like, oh my God, I almost had a heart attack. Right.
Yes. Yes.
And I'm like, oh boy, you right. All these things that have become part of our vernacular, and they are so that you don't even realize what you're doing to the person sitting next to you. Oh,
Right, right. And as that person, you or myself or whatever, you have to kind of just, for me anyway, I just sort of let it go. I
you
think,
have to, because what are you going to do?
what are you
You
going
can't
to do
call
about it?
everybody on everything and then make them feel right.
Right. You just have to let it go. And it's just a saying.
Yeah.
That's sort of the way that I felt, especially at work. Because people didn't know what was going on. Same thing
Right.
with you. People had no idea what was going on. So I completely understood that story about the differences between home and work.
Yeah.
Like I said, that really struck me. Another thing that I thought was so interesting, and I wonder if this is something that a lot of parents do, which is you and your husband, I believe, kind of felt like you needed to, I don't think the word is protect, but you wanted your other two children to have, again, sort of that normal life. So you didn't show, I think, a lot of your emotion, or maybe you didn't cry in front of them or something like that. And then there was an instance where one of the kids came to you. So I'd like you to talk about that.
Yes. And thank you for asking me. I think it's such an important story. And when people say to me, do you have any regrets? This is my regret. It's not about the care that Dahlia received. I believe she received the very best medical care from the professionals and here on the home front. But I have a regret that I learned from. So I like to share this story because I would have liked to have heard it from somebody else earlier on. It might have had an impact on how we moved forward, which is that our other kids were privy and front row to so much that no person, let alone child, should have to go through. I mean, their childhoods were so deeply altered by what was happening and what our house was like for those 8 years between Dahlia's being 9 and being 17. And so without really agreeing to it, my husband and I just both of us wanted to shoulder as much of the quote unquote burden as we could. We didn't want to put any more on the other kids than they were already carrying. And that did mean that we put on this kind of strong front for them. And we would always say things like, Dahlia knows how much she's loved and we're going to get through this and, whatever we said, but we didn't want to weigh them down in any additional way. And even like their doctor, all three kids had the same pediatrician, would say to us, like, let me come over and talk to the other kids, let's unpack it. And we were like, no, suitcases are good. We don't need to unpack anything. You know what I mean? Like, it was just, we were so afraid of them crumbling under the weight of all of it. And so one evening, Rob and I were already in bed when our eldest came in the room and really broke down and said, there's something wrong with me. And went on to share with us, I'm so scared and I'm so angry. And I pray and I pray and I pray, and Dahlia's not getting better. But you guys are fine. What's wrong with me? And, I think about when we talk about an aha moment, and I think sometimes our aha moments are stretched over many months or many years, but this was really an aha moment because it was like, oh my God, like it just hit me. We have done a disservice to these children by not showing them how frightened and angry and all the things we were.
Right.
And in doing that, they thought all these feelings were bad, right? And of course, they were so normal. Again, quote unquote normal. I know we keep using that word and both of us keep putting it in air quotes, but it really showed me that our kids need to see that we're stressed and scared and all these things so that they understand that these feelings are absolutely legitimate and that we can have them and we can incorporate them and we can move forward in a healthy way. And, even saying it now, it's like, oh my God, why didn't I just know that intuitively? But I didn't. I really was trying to do what I thought was right, but it has informed how I parent ever since. And even now, just little things that when I'm feeling stressed or vulnerable or whatever, I'll share it because they should know that little things can stress everybody out. It doesn't have to be, some huge thing, and that's okay. Like I'm feeling stressed or I'm feeling, here's what I'm going to do. And here's how, and so I definitely have learned to show those fractures more openly.
Yeah. Yeah. I, I guess I don't think that that's like the way what you did maybe is not, again, not normal. I think a lot of parents want to be like that. They want to protect their children. But I do agree with you that, sometimes even for ourselves, keeping it inside and not just sharing it with somebody, like you just said, hey, I'm stressed out. This is what's bothering me. And I need to go for a walk or whatever it is, just that makes us feel better.
Right. It makes us feel better. And also, it takes some of the power of the emotion away because we're just like, oh, that's what this is. It's not just this like unnamed like thing in our stomach. It's like, oh, okay, I know this feeling.
Right.
This is why I get anxious before giving a presentation. And that's what this is. And, here it is. High anxiety. I see you. I know you're here.
Right, right, right. Yeah. Another thing that I was thinking about was fear. So I can imagine that this must have been such a scary time. A disease that nobody, the medical community doesn't have a lot of experience with. You're charting your own course. You're doing all of this work yourself. Um, so there's you talk about living in fear and living with fear.
Yeah.
And so talk a little bit about that.
Yeah. This was an interesting realization for me when COVID hit was, wow, a lot of people are now experiencing what we've been living for some time on so many levels, right?
Mhm.
And I thought about this idea of living in fear and how when we live in something, if we think about that, that means we're surrounded by the thing, right? When we're living in fear, fear is surrounding us. And maybe we feel like if it surrounds us, uh, if it surrounds us in a way, it will make the real things bounce off of it because fear is all around us, right? Like we feel like we're inside of this fear, but living in any emotion requires a lot of energy, right? Because
Yes.
that is the becomes the dominant thing. And instead, we could consider living with fear. And even just, I'm a word person, obviously, but even just that word change changes for me how I think about it because now I'm living with fear, right? And so that's okay. It's unrealistic to think that the fear is not going to be there. But let's understand how much power it has. Is it in the passenger seat? Is it in the back seat or is it driving the car?
Right,
Right.
right, right,
And when we're living in fear, then we're in the back seat and fear's driving and we're just at its mercy. Instead
right,
of saying fear is here, anxiety is here, stress is here, all these other great things are here too, joy and, a lot of other really positive things. And we're going to all be here together. So let's figure out how to move forward effectively, all of us.
right, right. And I kind of I like the living with fear because it also reminds me that the other side of fear is courage.
Hmm.
And so living with fear is being courageous.
Yes, exactly. And of course, I would love that. Like, courage is not about not having fear, it's being afraid and doing it anyway. And that's something that I always wanted my kids to know because of course there's legitimate, very, very scary things. And what are you going to do
Right,
with that knowledge?
right, right. Um, so I wanted to just ask you, I've never written a book, so, and I don't, maybe a lot of my listeners have not written a book either. So tell us about this process. So one of the things I was curious about is, did you keep a journal? And is
Yeah.
that how you came to the book? Yeah.
Okay. So first of all, I bet a lot of listeners, if they haven't written a book, want to because I have read a statistic multiple times that 80% of people want to write a book.
Oh,
So
that's
I
really
think that's so
interesting.
funny.
Yeah,
Now, I
yeah,
mean, maybe people are just like, I should write a book, whatever. I don't know.
yeah.
But for me, I will say I did not keep a journal. When we were in the hospital for an extended period, we did, I think it was called like Care Bridge or something. I don't know. They used to have this like online journal that you could do to share with a lot of people what was happening.
Okay.
But that was just for 3 months. I did write several essays at that time that I was publishing and mostly in Huffington Post then. And so I had done, many essays, but I decided pretty kind of like in a moment at some point when I was like by Dahlia's bedside when she was napping that I was going to write a book. I just felt like this is a story that needs to be told.
Mm.
And I'm bearing witness here to something that should be shared. And so I decided to write a book. And I was very definitive about it from that moment that I decided to write. Now, I will say it was not totally out of the blue because I wrote a book and published a book in my 20s about
Okay.
graduating from college. So I had done that before. And my father was a writer and had written many, many books. So it was not like, I was joking that if Rob had come in and I was like, I've decided I'm going to run a marathon, like that, he would have been like, are you okay? That's bonkers. Because that is not something that would ever come out of my mouth. When he came home and I was like, I'm going to write a book, he's like, great. So it wasn't the craziest idea, apparently. But and then I wrote it. I originally thought it would be a memoir and essays. I was very, very comfortable with writing essays. Short form is just my comfort zone. And I had not written a memoir before, and you have to go much deeper.
Mm.
But as I started to put the essays together, it became clear that there was really a chronology here and that this was more of a memoir
Yeah.
in a more traditional sense rather than a memoir and essays. And at the time, I was spending a lot of time. Mitochondrial disease is an energy zapper, and Dahlia needed to nap during the day. And because she was an eyes-on patient, that meant that my husband or myself or a nurse trained specifically in her care had to have our eyes on her 24/7. She could never, ever, ever be in a room alone. So when she was napping, I would be by her bedside, and I wrote the book then. And in fact, had found my agent and publisher when Dahlia was still alive. So this was never a book and is not a book about my daughter's death. This
Mm.
is a book about her life and our life
Right.
together. And so that's when I wrote, yeah.
Wow. Wow. So did you find it very cathartic?
It's interesting. I think so because I think that things were so out of our control.
Mm,
And writing it allowed me to control the narrative, right? So I think in that sense, it was cathartic. And then, look, now I get to sit around and have conversations about Dahlia a lot of the time as I'm having these
right.
book conversations. And that's very, I don't know if it's cathartic, but it's wonderful because, when you
Sure.
lose somebody, sometimes you don't have the opportunity to talk about them because people are so uncomfortable. They don't want to quote unquote remind you.
Right.
But
Right.
I get
Right.
to talk about my people all the time now.
Yeah, which is wonderful. It's really
Yeah.
wonderful. I want to go back to something that you alluded to earlier. You said that you were judged
Oh,
by
yes,
deciding to work.
absolutely.
Yeah,
And
talk about
it's
that.
interesting because I will say my husband was not. And so we had so many people who had a front row seat to our lives because, as I mentioned, Dahlia was eyes on. So we had in-home nursing and we had PCAs, personal care attendants, and we had a million, OT and PT and this and that. So all these people really knew the intricacies of our home life, which is just so weird because usually your house is like your private sanctuary. Like people don't
Right.
know what goes on there. Everybody knew what was going on here. And there were people who questioned my decision to keep working. And it's so interesting to me that nobody overtly questioned my husband's decision to keep working,
Right.
even though I was the primary breadwinner.
Mhm.
Um, so that was particularly interesting. I mean, my husband is a public school teacher, and that everybody knew that,
Right. Right.
So, and I was in corporate. So it was not a secret there. But people would, and one person in particular wrote me a lengthy letter saying, what you're doing isn't right. You should be focusing 100% on Dahlia's care. And for me, it was so clear that the very best thing for Dahlia's care was for me to keep working for a number of reasons. Number one, Dahlia was going to school full time. She went with a private nurse, but Dahlia wasn't, it's not like Dahlia was home and I was going off to work. I mean, she went to school and I went to work. So that
Right.
was number one. Number two, I knew how to do my job at work, and it gave me a real sense of accomplishment. At home, half the time I had no clue what was going on. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
So being able
Yeah.
to go out and to be me, the me that I had been before, the me that I would be after, and to do something that I knew I was good at, that gave me a lot of strength that I could then bring to the home front, right?
Right.
And it was important for me to have hours during the day where I wasn't mom, nurse, all those other things. And I think this is true for anybody who chooses to work outside the home, whether or not they have a very intense medical situation on the home front. For me, it was a really important break from the intensity that I really believe benefited what was happening at home. And I think it was important for my other kids to see and for Dahlia to see that her disease wasn't changing every single thing, that we could go on and have other lives, that it was okay for me to go to work and for my other kids to go to school and, for us to do things that were not defined by Dahlia's illness when so very much of our lives was defined by Dahlia's illness.
Right. Right. And that's I think that's a really good point because I'm sure she saw because she was
Mhm.
going to school,
Right.
her brothers were going to school, and this is
Exactly.
what happens in other families. Like the
Exactly.
mom has to work, the dad has to work, the kids go to school, and then everybody's home for dinner, so to speak,
Yeah. And I
or
just felt
soccer
like,
or
my
whatever.
goodness.
Yeah.
Yeah. Baseball in our case. But I was just like,
Yeah.
what? It was so interesting to me. And my husband said, well, when people are making comments to you, they're probably questioning their own decisions. Everybody's
Mhm.
starring in their own movie, right? We know that. And it
Yeah.
was just interesting to me that people would A, think what they thought, but more important, would be ballsy enough to share it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Kind of.
Well, listen, you can always write a memoir. That's a way to be able to, get, air what's been inside of you.
Right. Right. Well, Jessica, is there anything that we haven't talked about that you'd like to share about your experience or just sort of, other things that you'd like to offer to people that are grieving and they're in this whatever their situation might be. If there's a medical situation,
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I
yeah,
think one of the things that really surprised me was learning that we can be in the worst situation imaginable. I mean, it was horrible what happened. And at the very same time, we can have joy. I would have thought before, if you were going through something so horrible, it would be impossible to find moments of beauty, moments of peace, moments of calm and joy. And I discovered that all those things can live side by side, and that the joy and the beauty and the meaning become much more powerful.
yeah,
And those moments that are ordinary are like a victory, right? I mean, we tried to create an ordinary evening at at the July 4th, which we talked about at the beginning of the conversation, and that was a failure. But some things you can do, and you can find and create joy and beauty and meaning even in a life that is so very difficult and so out of your control. And to me, that's not something I would have supposed beforehand.
right, right.
And I want to say
Oh,
one other thing on that.
yes, please.
When you find yourselves in the moments of joy or beauty or silliness or whatever, don't feel guilty. Because I think as grievers, we're so good at making ourselves feel guilty for everything. Like guilty if I'm having a good time, guilty if I'm smiling and laughing, guilty if I'm quote unquote grieving too long, guilty if I'm not grieving long enough, guilty because when somebody asked me how many kids I have, I didn't want to get into it. So I said two instead of three, whatever it is. Like
Right.
we need to give ourselves grace and to be able to say, however you want to get through the day. I mean, you're not hurting anybody else, right? But
Yeah.
we've got to lighten up on the number we do on ourselves because we're so good at making ourselves feel bad.
Yeah. Really, really good point. Really good point there. Well, thank you so much. Oh, one more thing I just want to mention. So, the book again is Breathtaking. I actually have it right here. I know it's going to be backwards, but it's
It's
called
not,
Breath.
it looks
Oh,
words to me.
good.
Yeah. Yes,
Called
breathtaking. Wherever you get your
Breathtaking.
books, Amazon, and you can get an ebook or an audiobook or, whatever you like. Any place that you get your books, you can find
Yeah.
it there. And I'd love
Yeah.
to connect with people. So if people want to find me on social or follow me at my website, jessicafeinstories.com. It's Fein. And
Good.
please check out my podcast. I don't know how you do it.
Yeah. It's a wonderful podcast. Really great.
Thank
Well,
you.
thank you so much for your time. Enjoyed speaking with you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Bye now.
Bye.